What happens when the person you're about to judge in court turns out to be the teacher who changed your entire life? Mrs. Anderson. Judge Caprio's voice cracked as he stared at the 83-year-old woman standing before his bench. The entire courtroom fell silent. The woman looked up, squinted through her glasses, and whispered, "Frankie. Little Frankie Caprio." What happened next would make grown men cry and restore faith in humanity for millions around the world. It was supposed to be a routine morning in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio had been handling traffic violations for over 2 decades, but this Tuesday felt different from the moment he walked into his courtroom. The docket was full, as usual, but something in the air suggested this wouldn't be an ordinary day. The first few cases had gone smoothly. A speeding ticket here, a parking violation there. Judge Caprio dispensed his characteristic blend of justice and compassion, often reducing fines for struggling families or dismissing charges when circumstances warranted mercy. Then came case number 47, Eleanor Anderson, 83 years old, charged with driving with an expired license. But Judge Caprio had no idea that the frail woman approaching his bench had shaped the very foundation of who he had become. Mrs. Anderson walked slowly toward the defendant's podium, her cane tapping against the marble floor. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with the dignity that only comes from a lifetime of service to others. Her gray hair was neatly arranged, and despite her age, her eyes still held the spark of intelligence that had inspired countless students. Judge Caprio glanced at the paperwork. "Mrs. Eleanor Anderson, you're charged with operating a vehicle with an expired license. How do you plead?" The woman looked up at him, adjusting her glasses. There was something familiar about the voice, something that stirred memories buried deep in her mind. "Your Honor," she began in a voice that, despite its frailty, carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I plead guilty. I had no idea my license had expired. I don't drive much anymore, just to the grocery store and to visit my late husband's grave." It was at that moment that recognition struck like lightning. Judge Caprio froze mid-sentence. He stared at the woman before him, his mind racing back 45 years to a classroom in Federal Hill. The voice, the posture, the way she held her head when she spoke, it all came flooding back. "Excuse me," Judge Caprio said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, did you teach at Reservoir Avenue Elementary School?" Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened. She squinted at the judge, studying his face intently. "Yes, I did. I taught there for 37 years. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. "Mrs. Anderson," Judge Caprio's voice was thick with emotion. "Did you teach a little boy named Frankie Caprio in the 3rd grade?" The moment of recognition was about to change everything. Mrs. Anderson gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Frankie? Little Frankie Caprio? The boy who used to sit in the front row and ask me a million questions?" Judge Caprio stood up from his bench, something he had never done in 23 years of presiding over his courtroom. Tears were forming in his eyes as 45 years melted away in an instant. "Mrs. Anderson, you changed my life," he said, his voice breaking. "You were the first person who ever told me I was smart. Do you remember? I was having trouble reading, and you stayed after school every day for 3 months to help me." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. "Of course I remember, Frankie. You were such a bright boy, but you just needed someone to believe in you." But nobody in that courtroom was prepared for what Judge Caprio revealed next. "Mrs. Anderson," Judge Caprio continued, now openly crying, "I need you to know something. When I was 8 years old, my father left us. My mother was working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. I felt worthless, like I was never going to amount to anything." The courtroom was absolutely riveted. Court officers, defendants waiting their turn, lawyers, and spectators all hung on every word. "But you," Judge Caprio pointed at his former teacher, "you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You told me I had a good heart and a sharp mind. You said I would make a difference in people's lives someday. Mrs. Anderson was sobbing now, as were half the people in the courtroom. Subscribe now and comment about a teacher who changed your life, because what happens next will show you the true power of compassion in action. Judge Caprio stepped down from his bench and walked around to where Mrs. Anderson was standing. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in that room approached his childhood teacher. Mrs. Anderson, he said softly, I became a judge because of you. Every day when I sit on this bench, I try to treat people with the same kindness and patience you showed me when I was just a scared little boy who couldn't read properly. He took her hands in his. You didn't just teach me to read, Mrs. Anderson. You taught me that everyone deserves a second chance, that everyone has potential, and that sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to change the trajectory of your entire life. But Mrs. Anderson wasn't finished surprising everyone in that courtroom. Through her tears, Mrs. Anderson looked up at Judge Caprio and smiled. Frankie, do you remember what I used to tell you when you would get frustrated with your reading? Judge Caprio nodded, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. Together, they recited the phrase that had become his life philosophy. It's not about how many times you fall down, it's about how many times you get back up. The courtroom erupted in applause. Even the stenographer was wiping away tears. Nobody expected what Judge Caprio did next. Mrs. Anderson, Judge Caprio announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, not only am I dismissing all charges against you, but I want to do something else. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet the woman who taught me that justice isn't about punishment, it's about understanding. She showed me that behind every person who makes a mistake is a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Judge Caprio then did something unprecedented in his courtroom. He asked Mrs. Anderson to sit in his judge's chair. Mrs. Anderson, you've been judging character and potential for 70 years. I think you've earned the right to sit in the judge's seat. The surprise wasn't over yet. As Mrs. Anderson carefully made her way to the judge's bench with Judge Caprio's assistance, he made an announcement that left everyone speechless. Furthermore, Judge Caprio declared, I'm establishing the Eleanor Anderson Second Chance Scholarship Fund right here in this courtroom. This fund will help children who are struggling in school get the extra attention and support they need. He turned to the packed courtroom. Mrs. Anderson didn't just teach reading and arithmetic. She taught hope. And hope is something this world needs more of. Mrs. Anderson, now seated in the judge's chair, looked out over the courtroom with the same compassionate eyes that had seen potential in a struggling 8-year-old boy decades earlier. Your Honor, she said with a smile, playfully addressing Judge Caprio, I have just one thing to say about this case. The entire courtroom leaned in to hear what the 83-year-old former teacher had to say. What she said next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. I always knew my little Frankie would make me proud, Mrs. Anderson announced from the judge's bench. But I never imagined he would grow up to be the kind of man who would show an old teacher more kindness than she ever showed him. She paused, looking directly at Judge Caprio with the same loving eyes that had encouraged him all those years ago. Frankie, you didn't just become a good judge. You became a good man. And that's the greatest lesson any teacher could ever hope to see. Judge Caprio was openly weeping now, as was most of the courtroom. The moment was so powerful that even the court officers had tears in their eyes. But the most beautiful moment was yet to come. Mrs. Anderson stood up from the judge's chair and walked back to where Judge Caprio was standing. Despite her age and frailty, she reached up and cupped his face in her hands, just as she had done when he was a little boy struggling with his homework. I'm so proud of you, Frankie, she whispered, loud enough for the courtroom microphones to pick up. You took everything I tried to teach you about kindness and fairness, and you've spent your whole career giving it to others. Judge Caprio hugged his former teacher, and the entire courtroom burst into sustained applause that lasted nearly 3 minutes. The impact of this moment was about to extend far beyond the courtroom walls. Unknown to Judge Caprio and Mrs. Anderson, the entire proceeding had been recorded by the court's video system. Within hours, a court clerk had uploaded the footage to social media, and by the end of the day, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Comments poured in from around the world. This is what humanity looks like. I'm crying at my desk watching this. Faith in humanity restored. Every teacher needs to see this. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. The story was far from over. 3 days after the courtroom encounter, Mrs. Anderson received a call from Judge Caprio. He wanted to invite her to be the guest of honor at his annual Justice with Heart award ceremony. Mrs. Anderson, Judge Caprio explained over the phone, I've been giving out awards for 20 years to people who make a difference in their communities. But this year, I want to give the Lifetime Achievement Award to someone who made a difference in my life before I even knew what a difference looked like. Mrs. Anderson accepted, and the ceremony became the most attended event in the court's history. At the ceremony, Judge Caprio revealed something that surprised even Mrs. Anderson. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Caprio announced to the packed auditorium, I need to tell you something about Mrs. Anderson that she probably doesn't even remember. He looked at his former teacher, who was seated in the front row wearing the beautiful dress her granddaughter had bought specially for the occasion. When I was in 3rd grade, my family had no money for school supplies. I was too proud to tell Mrs. Anderson, so I just sat in class every day without paper or pencils. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. One morning, I found a bag on my desk filled with notebooks, pencils, crayons, and everything else I needed. There was no note, no explanation. But I knew it was from Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson gasped from the audience. After all these years, she thought no one had ever known about her quiet acts of kindness. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. What Mrs. Anderson didn't know, Judge Caprio continued, was that I followed her to the parking lot after school that day. I saw her getting into an old car that was falling apart. I realized later that she had probably used her own money she didn't have much of, to buy those supplies for me. Judge Caprio's voice broke as he continued, that's when I learned that teaching isn't a job. It's a calling. And Mrs. Anderson answered that calling every single day for 37 years. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes. The evening concluded with a surprise that no one saw coming. Judge Caprio called Mrs. Anderson to the stage to receive her award. But as she slowly made her way up the steps, every person in the auditorium, judges, lawyers, police officers, city officials, and community members, stood up and began reciting in unison. It's not about how many times you fall down, it's about how many times you get back up. Mrs. Anderson stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the love and recognition, realizing that her simple philosophy had not only shaped one little boy but had become the guiding principle for an entire courtroom and community. Share this video if you believe in the power of teachers to change lives, because Mrs. Anderson's story proves that the best lessons aren't found in textbooks, they're found in the hearts of educators who see potential where others see problems. As Judge Caprio presented Mrs. Anderson with her award, he leaned into the microphone one final time. Mrs. Anderson taught me that justice without compassion is just cruelty with a gavel. Every day when I put on these robes, I remember that lesson. Every time I see someone standing before my bench, I try to see them the way Mrs. Anderson saw me, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with potential to be realized. He turned to face Mrs. Anderson directly. Thank you for teaching me that the most important thing we can do for each other is believe in each other's capacity for goodness. The legacy of that courtroom moment continues to inspire people around the world. Today, the Eleanor Anderson Second Chance Scholarship Fund has helped over 500 struggling students get the support they need. Teachers from around the globe have sent videos sharing their own stories of students who surprised them years later. But perhaps most importantly, Judge Caprio's courtroom philosophy, inspired by a 3rd-grade teacher who believed in a struggling boy, continues to show thousands of people each year that justice is most powerful when it's paired with understanding. Mrs. Anderson, now 87, still visits Judge Caprio's courtroom occasionally. She sits in the front row, watching her former student dispense the same kind of patient wisdom she once showed him. And every time she visits, Judge Caprio makes the same announcement: "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored today to have in our courtroom the teacher who taught us all what real justice looks like." Because sometimes, the most important lessons we learn aren't about law or procedure or protocol. They're about seeing the humanity in every person who walks through our doors, and remembering that behind every mistake is a human being who, just maybe, needs someone to believe in their potential to do better. That's the lesson Mrs. Anderson taught, and that's the lesson Judge Caprio continues to share with the world, one case at a time. But the story doesn't end there. 2 years later, something extraordinary happened that would bring their bond full circle. Mrs. Anderson, now 85, had been experiencing memory issues. Her family was concerned about her living alone, and her granddaughter Sarah had been trying to convince her to move into assisted living. One afternoon, Sarah brought her grandmother to Judge Caprio's courtroom, not for any legal matter, but because Mrs. Anderson had been asking about her Frankie and couldn't remember if he was real or just a dream. "Judge Caprio," Sarah explained quietly to the bailiff, "my grandmother keeps talking about a little boy named Frankie who became a judge. We weren't sure if it was her memory playing tricks on her, but then we saw the video online." When Judge Caprio learned that Mrs. Anderson was in his courtroom, he immediately called a recess. He approached Mrs. Anderson, who was sitting in the gallery looking confused and frail. At first, she didn't recognize him. The disease was taking its toll. "Mrs. Anderson," Judge Caprio said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "It's me, Frankie. Your student from Reservoir Avenue Elementary." For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, slowly, Mrs. Anderson's eyes focused on his face. She reached out and touched his cheek, just as she had done in the classroom so many years ago. "Frankie," she whispered. "Did you learn to read, sweetheart?" Judge Caprio's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Mrs. Anderson. I learned to read. And I learned so much more." What happened next would become the most viewed courtroom video in internet history. Judge Caprio stood up and addressed his courtroom, which was filled with defendants, lawyers, and court staff. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to meet someone very special. This is Mrs. Eleanor Anderson, and she's the reason I'm standing here today." He helped Mrs. Anderson to her feet and guided her to the front of the courtroom. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, speaking directly to her but loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want to tell you what happened to that little boy you helped learn to read." The entire courtroom listened as Judge Caprio recounted their story once more. "You took a scared, struggling 8-year-old boy and showed him kindness when no one else would. You stayed after school to help him read. You bought him school supplies with your own money. You told him he was smart when he felt stupid." Mrs. Anderson listened, sometimes understanding, sometimes confused, but always focusing on his voice with the attention she had once given to struggling students. "That little boy grew up to become a judge, Mrs. Anderson. And every single day, he tries to treat people with the same patience and compassion you showed him." Then Judge Caprio did something that amazed everyone present. He began to recite a children's book, The Little Engine That Could, the same book Mrs. Anderson had used to teach him to read all those years ago. "I think I can, I think I can, I think I can," he recited slowly and clearly. Mrs. Anderson's face lit up with recognition. "I think I can, I think I can," she repeated along with him, her voice gaining strength with each word. The moment was captured on video and shared millions of times with a simple caption, "A judge reading to his teacher." Word of the visit spread quickly. The next day, dozens of Mrs. Anderson's former students began arriving at the courthouse, each with their own story of how she had changed their lives. There was Marcus, now a doctor, who credited Mrs. Anderson with teaching him that everyone deserves respect regardless of their background. There was Lisa, a social worker, who said Mrs. Anderson taught her that listening was just as important as talking. One by one, they approached Mrs. Anderson, many of whom she didn't remember due to her condition, but each carrying a piece of the wisdom she had imparted decades earlier. Judge Caprio realized he needed to do something to honor Mrs. Anderson's legacy while she could still understand it. He arranged for a special ceremony in his courtroom, not a legal proceeding, but a celebration. Former students, fellow teachers, and community members filled every seat. Mrs. Anderson may not remember all of us, Judge Caprio told the gathering, but we remember her. And more importantly, we carry her lessons forward every day. He had prepared a special surprise. Working with the Providence School District, he had arranged for the elementary school where Mrs. Anderson taught to rename their library, the Eleanor Anderson Learning Center. When Mrs. Anderson heard the announcement, something remarkable happened. For just a moment, the fog of her condition seemed to lift. She looked around the courtroom filled with faces, some familiar, some not, and understood that these people were there because of something she had done. Did I do something good?" she asked Judge Caprio quietly. "Mrs. Anderson," he replied, taking her hands in his, "you did everything good. You spent your whole life planting seeds of kindness, and now we're all the trees that grew from those seeds." The ceremony concluded with everyone in the courtroom reciting together the phrase that had become Mrs. Anderson's legacy. "It's not about how many times you fall down, it's about how many times you get back up." Mrs. Anderson smiled, and for that moment, she was every bit the confident, caring teacher who had changed so many lives. 6 months later, Mrs. Anderson passed away peacefully in her sleep. Judge Caprio delivered the eulogy at her funeral, which was attended by hundreds of former students, colleagues, and community members whose lives she had touched. "Mrs. Anderson never knew she was changing the world," he said. "She thought she was just doing her job. But that's the thing about great teachers, they don't set out to be heroes. They just show up every day, believing in children who don't believe in themselves yet." Today, the Eleanor Anderson Learning Center hosts an annual, Second Chance, scholarship ceremony. Judge Caprio attends every year, and he always tells the recipients the same thing: "Mrs. Anderson taught me that the most important thing we can do is believe in each other's potential. Today, we're believing in yours." The scholarship fund has now helped over 1,000 students, and Judge Caprio's courtroom continues to operate on the principles Mrs. Anderson taught him, that everyone deserves dignity, everyone deserves a second chance, and everyone has the potential to rise above their circumstances. Mrs. Anderson's classroom motto still hangs in Judge Caprio's chambers: "It's not about how many times you fall down, it's about how many times you get back up." And every morning before he puts on his robes, Judge Caprio reads those words and remembers the teacher who saw greatness in a struggling little boy and helped him become the man he was meant to be. Because that's what great teachers do. They see not who we are, but who we can become. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to show them that their faith in us was not misplaced.